Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in today. I'm Alexandra Feingold, Project Manager for Clean Speech, and I'm so privileged to be here with Rabbi Mathias, COO of Aish Global. Rabbi Mathias also is an expert Israel advocacy leader. He led many groups to Israel through a foundation which he started called Hasbara Fellowships. This Hasbara Fellowships is about training people, college students, on how to speak about what's going on in Israel. And today we're going to be speaking about just that. We're going to be talking about how to talk about the war in Israel in a constructive and positive way, how we can use our words to educate and empower people to have meaningful, constructive discussions about what's going on in Israel rather than causing more divisiveness between people who are pro-Israel and people who are against Israel with what's going on right now. So I think it's going to be very important, meaningful discussion today. And thank you so much for Rabbi Mathias for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, awesome. So let's jump right in. So can you tell us a bit about your experience speaking to people with opposing viewpoints in regard to the war in Israel?
Yeah, sure. I mean, listen, people are very passionate about what's going on in Israel. It's pretty unbelievable when you just look at the news, whether it's CNN, Fox News, New York Times, it's the main story that's been going on since October 7th. And people are passionate about it because, sadly, the pictures and the videos we see and the reality on the ground is incredibly troubling. It's not just a political issue. I mean, there's people being killed. There's children being killed. So I think that just evokes tremendous emotion and passion. And from what I've come to see is that there are just two completely different narratives of what's happening and why it's happening, and both sides are incredibly passionate about the virtue and the correctness of their side. And so what that does is it creates just tremendous polarization, and it's hard for people to communicate with each other because they just really feel that they are so morally correct and the other side is so morally wrong.
Yeah.
And so it makes it very, very difficult.
It's such a heated issue, and people are so passionate about their beliefs with this. Have you ever actually successfully convinced somebody to see the opposing viewpoint?
So in my experience, I say this to people a lot, like if you have someone who's really, obviously I'm much more on the pro-Israel side. I side, with Israel. So if you're speaking with someone who is on who doesn't see it that way, you're not in one conversation or even in a few conversations going to get someone to completely flip and change their views. It's just not practical, right? Especially someone who's passionate, right? Maybe someone who doesn't really know anything. But if you're speaking to someone who has spent time looking at the situation, who's passionate about it, it's just not realistic. So you have to really define what your goal is. For me, the goal, often when I speak to people who are like I said, are much more anti-Israel, is to at least get them to see and acknowledge that there's two sides to the story, and that the other side, which maybe they're so against, at least has credibility, has reasoning behind why it's saying what it's saying, has fears of why it's acting the way it's acting. So for example, with Israel, people who are so, anti-Israel and they feel what Israel's doing is so terrible and wrong, to get them all of a sudden to say, oh, Israel's right, that's very difficult. But to get them at least to understand, why is Israel doing what they're doing? Israelis are living in fear. Israelis feel that this has been decades and decades of attacks against them. And that's within the context of thousands of years of anti-Semitism. So there's tremendous fear. So if you can get someone to just at least realize that and acknowledge that, that's definitely creating hopefully some movement. So you have to be realistic, I think, with what the goals are.
Hmm. And humanize Israelis, and I like
That's
that you
a part
that
of
you
it.
speak about talking about fears. How do you begin discussions? Like when you want to have when you know it's going to be a heated debate, how do you begin it so that it's not automatically off the bat people getting defensive?
So I think it's a great question, and I think this really also gets a lot to the heart of just communication in general, but especially in heated communication. I always want to start with acknowledging that I recognize and understand where the other side's coming from, because the first step in all communication is credibility. And if someone feels that you are just coming to just argue with them and argue your side and you only look at it one way, there's no real communication. It's just two people saying what they want to say. But
Hmm.
to be able to sit with someone and say, listen, I understand where you're coming from, right? I might not agree with it, but I understand it. And I think when it comes to the, what's happening in Israel, what's happening in Gaza, to be able to sit with someone and say, I see those pictures and videos of what's going in Gaza also, and it bothers me also. And it's horrible. It's terrible what's happening. So to be able to say that, first of all, because I believe it's true, so that's important. But also number two, I think when you're then going to get into a discussion with someone, they can at least see that you have empathy, you're understanding where they're coming from, so that where I might then disagree with them on a different issue, but because they see that I'm somewhat reasonable, because I'm understanding where they're coming from, it gives me a lot more credibility when I am going to argue with them. So I think it's really important to start with thinking about, maybe where do I agree with this person? Where do I understand where they're coming from? And start there, because then it builds a bridge and then you can get into maybe where you disagree more.
That's really powerful. Building a bridge by noticing where you're similar as opposed to where you're different, and validating the other person's plight and what they feel. And also, yeah,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
making sure that they know that you're like level-headed, that you see both,
totally.
that you have empathy.
Yeah, and by the way, it doesn't mean that you have to agree, with all of their political positions. I mean, let's just give an example, right? So, and I've had these discussions with people, very recently. People were very, very, very bothered by the humanitarian crisis that's happening in Gaza. So usually I have a very different understanding with this person of why that's happening, right? I would put much more of the blame on Hamas and the instigators of this conflict, where they're obviously putting much more blame on Israel's actions. So we disagree with about that. But if I can start by, like I said, just at least saying, I understand that there's a crisis here and I understand these people are in a terrible situation. I'm not agreeing that what's the cause of it, but at least we're just finding that bridge. So I think sometimes what happens is that people feel that, if I give a little bit, if I acknowledge a little bit of the other side's pain, then that means I'm agreeing with all of their political views. And that's not true. You can separate those two. And I think if you could do that, it just helps build a bridge.
Mhm. Are there specific words that you've noticed have made it more difficult to have positive conversations about the war in Israel?
Yeah, this is a big issue. I see this all the time. Because there's so much of a PR battle here, there's so much of a battle for minds and what people believe. We're in a world today, unfortunately, right? People are not spending, hours on understanding this conflict. They're looking at TikTok videos, right? They're
Right.
looking at Instagram posts. So they're getting their worldview in bite size 45-second clips. And really both sides, but I have to say, I think the anti-Israel side in some ways has done it better. They create buzzwords, and those buzzwords are by definition extreme because they're trying to get their point across, right? Nuance doesn't work in buzzwords. So using words like genocide, using words like apartheid, using words like indiscriminate violence, right? Where none of them accurately describe what's really going on, but when they're thrown out there and they keep throwing out there, they just shut down the ability to have a conversation because they're so extreme and they're so accusing of the worst atrocities, which are just not correct, that it's very difficult to build bridges when people use those types of terms.
What do you do when you feel like people are just saying things that are not correct? Like, if, in your opinion, people are totally saying lies, how do you politely tell them that?
So, listen, we're talking about where you're having a discussion with someone. If you're in a public forum, this might be different, but when I'm in a discussion with someone, I'll try to call them out on it, but do it in a way, again, that gives them the ability to maybe explain themselves. So for example, I was recently in a situation with someone where they said, oh, Israel's indiscriminately targeting Palestinian civilians.
Mhm.
So I said, do you really believe they're doing it indiscriminately? And they stopped for a second because they knew that they couldn't say yes, because indiscriminate just means that you're just blowing anybody up wherever you want. It's clear Israel's literally dropped millions of flyers in Gaza telling civilians to leave certain areas. They're clearly going after military, they're not, got Hamas terrorist targets. Now, unfortunately, many innocent people are being caught up in it, but Israel's not just if it was indiscriminate, there'd literally be hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people killed, because is what Israel, the military power they have. So I said to them, do you really believe it's indiscriminate? And they stopped for a second. I said, well, not really fully indiscriminate, but they're not being careful enough. Okay, they're not being careful enough. That's a different take on it that we can discuss. So I think, again, you need to, by the way, everything that I'm saying, you need both sides to want to have a discussion. If you're with someone who just doesn't want to have a discussion, they're just trying to get their political points across. So just like, what I said in the beginning, you have to gain credibility with someone. The other side also has to gain credibility with you. So if you're in a situation where someone is just clear, they're not interested in having a discussion, there's no point of having the discussion. But if you're with someone that you see, it is open, then I think appropriately calling them out on these terms and the words they use that are not accurate, hopefully we'll get them to take a step back and say, you're right. I don't really mean that. This is what I really mean. And then, okay. And then you can have a discussion about that.
Definitely, yeah. And I like how you talked about avoiding generalizing, or words like indiscriminately, always, never, or just words that make it sound like one side is completely good or completely innocent or completely bad. I think
Yeah.
that's something really important to
By the
remember.
way, the pro-Israel side does this as well. When we talk about destroying them all, killing, just destroying Gaza, you hear people saying like that. And listen, I understand. Like I said in the beginning, there's tremendous um, anger, there's tremendous fear, there's tremendous emotion by what happened on October 7th and what continues to happen. There's still rockets being shot into Israeli cities, but those are not helpful words. And again, if you ask someone, like when someone says, "Oh, we should destroy Gaza," so you say to them, "Well, do you really mean that we should destroy like innocent people?" No, no, no.
Right.
I don't really mean that. I mean the terrorists. Okay, so say the terrorists, because if you just say destroy it all, like that creates, it's the same thing. You're just creating through your words that maybe you don't really mean, but a much more extreme view that shuts down communication.
Yeah, it's so much more helpful to get very specific, because then you can actually argue or discuss in a real way actual specifics. But if you're
Yeah,
just talking about mass, just ideas or
yeah,
just generalities, then it's really hard.
yeah,
So something I know that you happen to be an expert at, because I know you personally, is being patient and cool and level-headed in these heated discussions. How do you how do you avoid getting offended when people are personally when people could personally be saying things that actually impacts you and affects you, and you don't take it to heart and you're not actually getting angry in the heat of the moment? How do you prevent yourself from taking things personally when you're talking about this?
yeah. Well, first of all, you're right. I have a more calm demeanor, so that helps me. But doesn't help everybody. It doesn't mean that I don't get offended, and it doesn't mean that I don't get hurt even by what people say. I mean, I've been in many discussions, especially recently, and people sending me things, telling me things that it's very hurtful. But I think you have to try to keep the bigger picture and the end game in mind. And, like I said, I think you also have to, like, we mentioned this a little bit before, you have to separate who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who you just feel has really bad intentions and is just, there's really almost no reason to have that discussion. But if you're speaking with someone that you think, what, wants to have a discussion, is open, just has very different views, has been getting their information from a very different place, then again, it's a little bit, there's a Jewish concept of, like, judging people favorably. And that's a big part of, I know, the clean speech campaign and how we communicate to people. And you have to try to do that the best you can and say, listen, this person, this is what they believe, because this is where they're getting their information. This is how they look at the world. This is who they're surrounded by. And I'm here trying to at least give them a different opinion. So that helps me, keep a little bit of a calm and not get angry, because I realize that's just going to defeat the purpose of what, we're trying to accomplish.
So really separating ideas from people.
Yeah, yeah. Don't exactly. This person is sharing ideas that maybe you find difficult, but they as a person are open to having a discussion with you, and that is the bigger goal.
hmm I think so many people since October 7th have felt also targeted on social media, obviously fighting this war not only in Israel, but also on social media for Jews everywhere. And I know personally that a lot of people have just kind of given up posting about what they believe with this conflict because they receive so much backlash. Do you think it's worth it for people to try to educate people on social media and like fight this war, so to speak, there? Or do you think it's just not the right time and place for that?
I think you have to pick your battles. I think if social media can be an incredible tool because you can reach so many people. And if you're trying to, get your message out to people that, are open to hearing it, then yeah, social media is amazing. Getting into heated debates with people, like I said before, who just are just never ever going to listen to what you have to say, is probably a waste of time. It could be, if you go to, I see some, you read in articles in the New York Times and you go into the comment section. I don't know how many people, read the comments, but some articles get hundreds and hundreds, not thousands of comments, and putting a comment there that, supports your view. So at least people see that there's another side. Yeah, that's also important. So I think you just have to pick your battles of like, if I'm getting a viewpoint out to people who are going to see it right now that maybe have not seen something, or at least they'll see there's more people that believe it, I think it's very productive. But don't get caught into like all kinds of back and forth with people that you just know you're never going to convince, and they just unfortunately, are not open.
Hmm. When the conversation is getting to a point where it's just back and forth, they're not open anymore, you can tell it's really not going anywhere. How do you understand like it's time to stop and it's not worth it to keep going at this point? What in the conversation lets you know that?
Um, I think when there's like questions stop being asked, if I think when you're in a conversation with someone and you're asking them like, what do you think about this?
Hmm.
Or oh, and you see that there's at least some recognition of, even if they disagree, but they hear what you're saying, then it's a valuable conversation. But if it's just literally, this is what I think, this is what I think, this is what I think, and there's no semblance of like asking the other person what they think, or having a dialogue, then there's really no point of continuing. That's what I've come to see, is, and that's why I try, like I said in the beginning, of not of building that bridge. I try to ask people questions like, well, what do you think about this? I want to hear what you think, even if I know that their answer is probably not going to be what I agree with. But by doing that, you're creating a more of a conversation,
And you
and
really listen to them. Like I think a lot of people, that's such a good tip to say, what do you think? Because it lets them think, oh, they're open to receiving what I have to say. They're really listening to me. But you actually are listening to them, which is
yeah,
so, it can be so hard to do if you really find their beliefs like painful or like offensive.
yeah, yeah. But you also see, you like, there's obviously facts, and there's history, and there's like reality. You can't ignore that. But there's also a lot of perception, and there's a lot of things that you start to see are commonalities. I've speaking to people who are, again, like really anti-Israel, but they're also, a lot of them are like under fear of like being shut down their views, and being accused of anti-Semitism. And so it's like, now that's a healthy debate. When does anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, words go into anti? When does it become anti-Semitic? And I've had people who are very anti-Israel tell me that they see anti-Semitism in that world. So there's definitely, it's there, but that's a discussion that you can have. Like, when does it become anti-Semitism? When is it not anti-Semitism? But to hear them tell me about how they and others sometimes feel incredibly intimidated to even put their views out there, right? That's something I can empathize with, right? And again, I might disagree with their views, but so it is being able to listen, to understand, and to me that's important, even if you disagree with it, but to understand more where people are coming from, that's important.
Yeah, listening is just as important as speaking. That was a huge part of the Clean Speech campaign. Um, Yeah. So do you have any final sort of strategies for people to go out there and speak constructively about the war in Israel? Tips?
I think number one, I think you mentioned this before, humanize it. Facts and figures and dates and this, like, that only goes so far, but telling people stories, telling people realities is so powerful. I mean, just one that pops in my head. It's a little dated, but not so much. As I remember once speaking to a mother who lived in Sderot, which is, an Israeli city right on the border with Gaza. And this was before October 7th, but unfortunately for a long, long time, Israelis have had rockets being shot at them. So instead of talking about the number of rockets and what's happening in the history, I remember she said, the siren went off in Sderot, and generally you have 15 seconds to get to a shelter. And she has two children. And she literally, the first thing she had to think about in her mind was, which one of my children am I going to try to get first into the shelter? Right. And that's such a powerful story. Yeah, I can see by your reaction, and it's real. So that just it gets home to people so much more powerfully, the reality of what's happening. So humanizing it, telling stories of what's happening. Don't just, now there is a place for facts, and because you can't just rely on anecdotes, but make sure that you're and also personalizing it for people. Like, what would you do if you were in this situation? What would you want your government to do if you were in this situation? Sort of make people feel it, like put themselves in those shoes, I think is really effective. And then, like the other things I said before, just try to build bridges, find as many places as you can to come to an agreement, to be to always try to be, I think, the moderate, to the more you can maybe show that a different view is more extreme, but the view that you're putting forth is the more moderate position,
Oh,
is
that's
what's
interesting. Could
important.
you give an example for Israel?
Yeah, so an example like recently they've dealt with is so for an example, a lot of people are saying, well, Israel's committing, genocide.
Right.
So to say someone, listen, you can look at this situation in a few ways. You can either say Israel's just indiscriminately killing innocent people. That's number one. You could look at the other side and say, you know what, Israel is only trying to kill terrorists, and they're and any innocent person who's killed is just, unfortunately, is an unfortunate consequence. Or you could say that there's a middle ground, which is that Israel's trying to kill the terrorists. They're doing the best they can, but yeah, they make mistakes. They sometimes, innocent people are killed. That's a terrible thing. We should all do whatever we can to vote to say that that's wrong, but that's not their intention, right? And so
Uh-huh.
that sort of deflates a little bit of their side, which is like, oh, Israel's just killing innocent people, which is not true. By saying, listen, yeah, you're right. Sometimes Israel makes mistakes. Sometimes Israel does things that, probably they wish they didn't do. And it causes, but that at least creates a middle ground that, shows that it's the more moderate position. Another example is, when people really criticize, like, Israel's a lot of people feel like from the beginning, you hear a lot of people saying is from the river to the sea, right? Which means that, like, get rid of Israel. Israel from the very beginning shouldn't exist, right? So when you show people, that's a very extreme view, where most Israelis want a two-state solution. They want an Israeli state. They want a Palestinian state. Obviously, they have to be able to live in peace. That's a much more moderate position. So as much as you can show the moderate, middle ground, I think gains a lot of credibility.
Definitely. Wow, you gave so many powerful tips. I want to recap, but I'm definitely going to miss a few. But let's just try. Oh, listen, show empathy, humanize others, ask questions, ask other people that you're engaging in these discussions with, what do you feel about the fact that XYZ? Um,
Yeah, tell
Talk about the more
stories.
moderate approach. I
Yeah,
like that one a lot. And
yeah.
don't throw out any buzzwords. Avoid genocide, avoid just like any sort of generalizations. Always, never. I really, really think this conversation was so useful and helpful. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Hope you enjoy. Thank you so much. Bye. Thanks for listening.